At 3:22 p.m. on September 18, 1944, First Lieutenant David Allen Prescott looked down at the control stick in his hands and realized it was no longer connected to anything. The stick moved freely, flopping side to side like a dead fish. The cables that linked it to the ailerons and elevator severed somewhere behind his seat. His P-47 Thunderbolt was flying at 8,000 feet over the Belgian countryside, trailing smoke from 2 engines' wounds, and he had just lost the ability to control it. 24 years old, former crop duster from Chillicothe, Missouri, 17 aerial victories, and approximately 90 seconds from dying in an aircraft he could no longer steer. The mission had been a milk run. That's what the briefing officer had called it. Escort duty for a squadron of B-24 Liberators hitting a marshalling yard near Cologne. Light flak expected minimal fighter opposition. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out by September 1944, hemorrhaging pilots faster than it could train them, burning aviation fuel it could no longer replace. The briefing officer had actually smiled when he said it would be an easy day. The briefing officer was not flying over Belgium at 3:22 p.m. Prescott was leading Viper Blue Flight, 4 P-47D Thunderbolts from the 356th Fighter Group, 361st Fighter Squadron, based at RAF Martlesham Heath in Suffolk. The Thunderbolt was the largest and heaviest single-engine fighter of the war, 7 tons fully loaded, powered by a 2,800 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine that could push the aircraft to over 430 miles per hour in level flight. The pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, because it flew like a locomotive and hit like one too. 8.50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, capable of throwing 3 pounds of lead per second at anything unfortunate enough to be in front of it. The Thunderbolt's greatest virtue was its durability. The P-47 could absorb punishment that would have destroyed any other fighter in the sky. Pilots had brought them home with cylinders shot off the engine, with control surfaces shredded, with holes in the fuselage large enough to climb through. The radial engine had no liquid cooling system to leak or rupture. It was air-cooled, and it would keep running as long as most of its 18 cylinders still fired. Republic Aviation had built the P-47 to survive, and it did. But even the Thunderbolt had limits. Prescott had grown up on a farm outside Chillicothe, the youngest of 4 brothers in a family that had worked the same Missouri dirt for 3 generations. His father had died when David was 12, a tractor accident during harvest, the kind of random tragedy that farming families learn to accept. His mother had kept the farm running through the Depression, selling off parcels one by one until only the house and 40 acres remained. David had discovered flying at 16 when a barnstormer landed in a pasture outside town and offered rides for 50 cents. That first flight, 10 minutes in an open cockpit biplane, the wind tearing at his hair, the patchwork fields spinning below, had changed everything. He worked odd jobs for 2 years, saved every penny, and earned his pilot's license at 18. By 20, he was crop dusting for farmers across 3 counties, flying a battered Stearman so low that the wheat brushed his landing gear. Crop dusting taught him things that fighter training never could. It taught him to fly by feel, to sense the aircraft's attitude through the seat of his pants rather than the instrument panel. It taught him to operate at the edge of the envelope, where a moment's inattention meant a cartwheel into a cornfield. It taught him that an airplane would do almost anything you asked, if you asked correctly. When the war came, Prescott enlisted immediately. His crop dusting experience earned him a slot in fighter training, and his natural instincts, honed in those low-altitude passes over Missouri farmland, made him a natural combat pilot. He had arrived in England in March 1944, had scored his first kill in April, and had become an ace by June. 17 victories in 6 months. The Germans had learned to fear the Thunderbolt with the black and white checkerboard nose, the one flown by the pilot who seemed to know what they would do before they did it. Now, on September 18th, those instincts were about to be tested in ways that no amount of training could prepare for. The 5 Focke-Wulf 190s appeared at 2:47 p.m., climbing out of the cloud layer below like wolves emerging from a forest. They were FW-190A8 models, the latest variant, armed with 420mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns, painted in mottled gray camouflage with yellow identification bands around their rear fuselages. Eastern Front markings. Veteran pilots transferred west to shore up the collapsing Reich air defense. They flew in a loose swarm formation, hunting with the easy coordination of men who had killed together many times before. The German flight leader was Hauptmann Victor Ehrlich. Prescott would not learn this name until after the war, when historians began piecing together the Luftwaffe records that survived the Reich's collapse. Ehrlich was 31 years old, a former instructor at the fighter school in Verneuchen, credited with 67 aerial victories, 41 on the Eastern Front, 26 against American and British aircraft over Germany. He had survived 4 years of air combat through a combination of skill, aggression, and the kind of situational awareness that let him see threats before they materialized. Ehrlich saw Prescott's flight before Prescott saw him. The 4 Thunderbolts were at 12,000 feet, cruising in a finger-4 formation, their attention focused on the bomber stream 5 miles ahead. They were not expecting attack. The Luftwaffe had been invisible for weeks, conserving strength, avoiding confrontation. The American pilots had grown complacent. Complacency killed pilots. Viper Blue, break right, bandits, 6 o'clock low. The call came from Lieutenant Charles Chuck Bergstrom, Prescott's wingman, who had caught a glint of reflected sunlight on metal below. Too late. The Focke-Wulfs were already firing. Prescott slammed his stick right and hauled back, trying to pull his Thunderbolt out of the Germans' gun sights. The P-47 responded instantly, its massive frame rolling into a climbing turn that pushed him deep into his seat. He heard the hammering of cannon fire, felt impacts shudder through the airframe, saw tracers flash past his canopy like burning rain. His number 3 man, Lieutenant William Billy Patterson, 22 years old, from Duluth, Minnesota, took the first burst. Patterson's P-47 staggered as 20mm shells ripped through the engine cowling, blowing 2 cylinders completely off the radial engine. Oil sprayed across his windscreen, blinding him. His propeller began to windmill, the engine seizing, and his Thunderbolt dropped away from the formation, trailing black smoke. "Billy's hit." Bergstrom's voice was sharp, urgent. "He's going down." "Stay with him, Chuck. Get him to the deck." Prescott was already reversing his turn, bringing his nose around toward the German fighters. "Viper Blue 4, you're with me." Lieutenant Marcus Webb, the 4th member of the flight, answered with 2 clicks of his microphone. Webb was the quiet one, a 23-year-old from Spokane, Washington, who rarely spoke and never missed. He had 9 kills, all confirmed, all clean shots through the cockpit or engine. He flew on Prescott's wing like a shadow. The dogfight developed in the narrow space between 8,000 and 14,000 feet. 5 German fighters against 2 American, with 2 more Americans spiraling down toward the Belgian farmland below. Prescott and Webb fought back-to-back, covering each other, trading altitude for speed and speed for position. The Thunderbolts were heavier than the Focke-Wulfs, slower to accelerate, but faster in a dive. Prescott used that advantage, climbing and diving, refusing to turn with the more nimble German fighters. He got his first kill at 3:04 p.m. A Focke-Wulf made the mistake of following him into a dive, trying to match his speed, and Prescott waited until the German was committed before pulling up hard, bleeding energy in a climbing chandelle that brought him onto the 190's tail. The German tried to roll away, but he was too slow, and Prescott's 850s caught him broadside. The Focke-Wulf disintegrated, its fuel tanks exploding, its pilot never clearing the cockpit. "Splash one," Prescott called. Kill number 18. But the other 4 Germans were still fighting. Webb got the second one, a deflection shot at 45 degrees that walked tracers across the Focke-Wulf's engine and into the cockpit. The German fighter rolled inverted and dove straight into a cloud bank, never to emerge. 2 down, 3 to go. Then Webb took a hit. The 20mm shell struck his engine cowling and exploded inside the accessory section, destroying the oil pump and severing the fuel lines. Webb's Pratt and Whitney began to die immediately, its 18 cylinders starving for oil, metal grinding against metal at 2,700 RPM. He had maybe 2 minutes of power remaining. "Blue lead, I'm hit. Engine's going." Webb's voice was calm, almost conversational. "I'll try for the deck." "Go, Marcus. Get out of here." Webb peeled away, his smoking Thunderbolt descending toward the Belgian countryside, leaving Prescott alone against 3 Focke-Wulfs flown by Eastern Front veterans. At 3:11 p.m., Hauptmann Victor Ehrlich began his attack run on the last remaining American. Ehrlich was a patient hunter. He had watched his wingmen die, watched the American pick them off with precise, economical shooting, and he had learned. This was not a novice. This was a killer, a man who understood air combat at an instinctive level. Ehrlich respected that. He also intended to kill him. The three remaining Focke-Wulfs split into a loose formation, one high, one low, one trailing. Classic bounce tactics designed to give the target no escape route. If Prescott climbed, the high man would dive on him. If he dove, the low man would zoom up to meet him. If he tried to run, the trailer would chase him down. 3 angles of attack, 3 guns converging on a single point. Prescott saw the trap developing. He had flown against German veterans before, had learned their tactics over 17 engagements, had survived by understanding how they thought. The 3-point trap was elegant, nearly impossible to escape, if you played by the rules. Prescott did not intend to play by the rules. At 3:14 p.m., instead of climbing or diving or running, he did something no rational pilot would do. He throttled back to near stall speed, dropped his flaps, and pointed his nose directly at the trailing Focke-Wulf. The P-47's airspeed dropped from 320 miles per hour to 180 in seconds, and Prescott hung there in the sky, nearly motionless, his 8 guns pointed at the German who had expected to be the hunter. The trailing German panicked. He had never seen an American pilot do this, had never encountered an enemy who would sacrifice all his energy, all his speed, all his options just to get a shot. He tried to break left, but it was too late. Prescott fired a 3-second burst that shattered the Focke-Wulf's canopy and killed the pilot instantly. 3 down. But the maneuver had cost him everything. Prescott was slow, nearly stalled, with 2 Focke-Wulfs diving on him from above and below. He had no energy to evade, no speed to run. He shoved his throttle forward, praying for the Pratt & Whitney to give him back his airspeed, but the big radial engine needed time to accelerate 7 tons of Thunderbolt. Time he did not have. Ehrlich hit him first. The Hauptmann's 420mm cannons raked Prescott's P-47 from nose to tail, shells punching through aluminum skin, shattering instruments, severing cables and hydraulic lines. Prescott felt the impacts like hammer blows, felt his aircraft shudder and lurch, felt something wet spray across his face, blood. His own blood, from a fragment wound in his forehead. The second German hit him from below. 20mm shells tore through the belly of the Thunderbolt, destroying the radio, smashing the battery, severing the elevator cables. The stick went slack in Prescott's hand. His P-47 was no longer responding to control inputs. It was flying, but he was no longer flying it. If you want to see how a pilot with no controls landed a 7-ton fighter through sheer force of will, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Prescott. The P-47 entered a gentle dive, its nose dropping toward the Belgian farmland 8,000 feet below. Without elevator control, Prescott could not raise the nose. Without aileron control, he could not level the wings. The aircraft was descending at roughly 1,500 feet per minute, which gave him approximately 5 minutes before impact. 5 minutes to figure out how to fly an unflyable aircraft. Prescott ran through his options. The stick was useless. The cables to the ailerons and elevator had been severed somewhere in the fuselage, probably where the 20mm shells had punched through. The rudder pedal still worked. He could feel resistance when he pushed them, could see the nose yaw slightly left and right. But the rudder alone could not keep the aircraft level. The rudder alone could not pull them out of a dive. The trim tabs. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt. The P-47 had electric trim tabs on the elevator and ailerons, small adjustable surfaces that pilots use to fine-tune the aircraft's attitude during flight. The trim system was separate from the main control cables. It ran on electrical motors, powered by the aircraft's generator. If the generator was still running, if the engine was still running, the trim might still work. He reached for the trim wheel on the left side of his cockpit. The elevator trim wheel moved. Prescott felt the nose respond, felt the dive begin to shallow as the small trim tab on the tail changed the airflow over the elevator surface. It was working. The trim was working. He experimented carefully, adjusting the elevator trim until the P-47 was flying level, then adding a touch of nose up to begin a gradual climb. The aircraft responded sluggishly, fighting him every inch, but it responded. He was flying again, not with the stick, not with the cables, but with the electric motors that drove the trim tabs. It was like steering a ship with a broken rudder, using only the sails. But it was working. The aileron trim was harder. The P-47's ailerons were huge, designed to roll 7 tons of fighter with authority, and the trim tabs were small, meant only for minor adjustments. When Prescott tried to level the wings using aileron trim, the response was barely perceptible. The aircraft continued to drift right, its wings canted at an angle that would eventually spiral into an unrecoverable bank. He used the rudder. By combining rudder input with aileron trim, he could approximate level flight. Kick the rudder left, adjust the trim, kick the rudder again. It was exhausting, requiring constant attention, constant adjustment. His wounded forehead was bleeding into his eyes. His hands were shaking from adrenaline and blood loss. But the P-47 was flying. The technique was something he had never been taught, something that existed in no manual, something that he was inventing moment by moment as his crippled aircraft carried him west. The trim tabs were designed to make minor adjustments, to correct for fuel burn or payload changes, not to replace the primary flight controls entirely. What Prescott was doing was the aeronautical equivalent of steering a car with a screwdriver jammed into the steering column. Technically possible, but so far outside normal parameters that no engineer would have predicted it. Every few seconds, the P-47 would begin to drift, its nose dropping or its wings tilting, and Prescott would have to correct with tiny adjustments to the trim wheels. The elevator trim wheel was on his left, the aileron trim on his right, and he worked them constantly, his hands moving between the two in a rhythm that became almost unconscious. Turn the elevator trim a quarter inch, kick the rudder, adjust the aileron trim, kick the rudder again, hold, wait, breathe. The cockpit was a shambles around him. The instrument panel had taken multiple hits, leaving half the gauges shattered or dead. His airspeed indicator still worked, 180 miles per hour, climbing slowly as the aircraft stabilized. His altimeter still worked, 8,200 feet, holding steady. His artificial horizon was gone, the gyro destroyed, but he didn't need it. He could see the real horizon through the shattered canopy, and he used it to keep his wings level. The cold was becoming a problem. At 8,000 feet, the outside air temperature was well below freezing, and the shattered canopy let that air pour into the cockpit. Prescott's flight suit was designed for high-altitude operations, but it was not designed for a cockpit open to the elements. His fingers were growing numb. His face, wet with blood, was beginning to freeze. He could feel his reactions slowing as the cold seeped into his muscles. He had to get lower, warmer air, thicker air that would help the damaged engine produce more power. He adjusted the elevator trim, letting the nose drop slightly, beginning a gradual descent. The P-47 responded, sinking toward the Belgian countryside at perhaps 500 feet per minute. The two remaining Focke-Wulfs circled above him, watching. Ehrlich had seen the Americans' aircraft take devastating damage. He had seen the P-47 enter its death dive, had watched with professional satisfaction as another enemy fell from the sky. But then the dive had stopped. The American had somehow regained control. The Thunderbolt was flying west, toward the Allied lines, trailing smoke but maintaining altitude. Ehrlich rolled into another attack run. At 3:28 p.m., the Hauptmann made his second pass on Prescott's crippled fighter. His 20mm cannons hammered the P-47's engine cowling, blowing apart 3 more cylinders, sending oil streaming back across the windscreen. Prescott's engine began to run rough, its smooth roar degrading into a stuttering cough as cylinder after cylinder failed. But the engine kept running, 15 cylinders, then 12, then 9. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 had been designed with redundancy, built to survive exactly this kind of damage. As long as enough cylinders fired to turn the propeller, as long as the crankshaft held together, the engine would produce power. The second Focke-Wulf attacked from below, raking the P-47's belly again, destroying what remained of the hydraulic system. Prescott's landing gear indicator lights flickered and died. His flap system went dead. When he tried to move the throttle, it jammed, stuck at roughly 60% power. The Germans made 4 more passes. They fired until their ammunition was exhausted, until their guns clicked empty on smoking chambers. They hit Prescott's Thunderbolt with over 220mm cannon shells and more than 1,000 rounds of 13mm machine gun fire. They destroyed the radio, the battery, the hydraulic system, and the pneumatic system. They killed 6 of the 18 engine cylinders. They shattered the canopy, wounded the pilot in 3 places, and severed every primary flight control cable in the aircraft. And still, the P-47 flew. At 3:41 p.m., Hauptmann Victor Ehrlich broke off his attack. He was out of ammunition, low on fuel, and the American was still flying. Ehrlich had never seen anything like it. He had shot down British Spitfires with single bursts. He had killed Russian Yaks with glancing blows. But this American, in his battered Thunderbolt, simply refused to die. Ehrlich waggled his wings, a pilot's salute, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another, and turned east toward Germany. His wingman followed. They had done everything they could. Prescott watched them go. His face was covered in blood, his hands were cramping on the useless stick, and his engine was dying by degrees. But he was still flying, still heading west, still alive. The Belgian coast appeared at 4:15 p.m. Prescott crossed the front lines at 3,500 feet, his Thunderbolt staggering through the sky like a drunk, its engine running on perhaps 5 cylinders, its control surfaces responding to nothing but trim tabs and prayer. Below him, American soldiers looked up at the smoking fighter and wondered how it was still in the air. Prescott had a new problem now. He had to land. The P-47 required a landing speed of approximately 100 miles per hour. The pilot would reduce power, lower flaps, drop the landing gear, and glide in for a controlled touchdown. It was a straightforward procedure, practiced hundreds of times, requiring only basic control authority. Prescott had no flaps. The hydraulic system was destroyed. He had no gear indicator, no way to know if the landing gear would extend or lock. His throttle was jammed at 60%, which meant he was flying at nearly 250 miles per hour with no way to slow down, and his only flight controls were the trim tabs and rudder. He spotted the airfield at 4:23 p.m., a B-26 Marauder base near the Belgian town of Florennes. Its runway, a long gray scar across the green countryside. It was not his base. It was not even a P-47 base, but it was a runway, and Prescott needed a runway. He began his approach. The tower at Florennes saw him coming, a P-47 trailing smoke, its canopy shattered, its engine coughing and backfiring. They cleared the runway immediately, scrambling fire trucks and ambulances to the taxiways. The tower operator tried to contact the pilot by radio, but there was no response. The P-47's radio was dead. Prescott set up for a long, straight-in approach. He could not turn effectively. Every turn risked losing control entirely. He aimed for the end of the runway, 5 miles out, and began to descend using elevator trim. Down, slowly down, the altimeter unwinding, 3,000 feet, 2,500 feet, 2,000 feet. At 1,500 feet, he pulled the emergency landing gear release. The P-47's landing gear was designed to extend by gravity if the hydraulic system failed. A lever in the cockpit released the gear door locks, and the weight of the wheels pulled them down. In theory, the gear would fall into place and lock automatically. In theory. Prescott felt a thump beneath his feet. The gear doors had opened. He felt the aircraft drag increase as the wheels dropped into the airstream, but he had no indicator lights, no way to confirm that the gear had locked. If it hadn't, if even one wheel failed to lock, the Thunderbolt would collapse on touchdown, cartwheel down the runway, and explode. He had no choice but to try. At 500 feet, Prescott realized he was coming in too fast. His throttle was stuck, his engine still producing power, and his airspeed was nearly 200 miles per hour, twice the normal landing speed. He would hit the runway like a bullet, and 7 tons of Thunderbolt would try to fly back into the air on impact. He needed to kill the engine, the mixture control. Every piston engine had a mixture control that adjusted the fuel-to-air ratio. Pull it to the full lean position and the engine would starve for fuel. It would die. Prescott reached down with his right hand, found the mixture lever, and pulled it to idle cutoff. The Pratt & Whitney coughed once, twice, and fell silent. The propeller windmilled to a stop, its 3 blades frozen at odd angles. The P-47 was now a glider, a 7-ton glider with a wounded pilot and no flight controls. The runway rushed up to meet him. At 4:31 p.m. on September 18, 1944, First Lieutenant David Allen Prescott touched down at Florennes Airfield at approximately 165 miles per hour. The P-47's landing gear held. The tires screamed against the concrete, rubber burning, smoke billowing. The aircraft bounced, lifted back into the air, and slammed down again. Prescott had no brakes, the hydraulic system was destroyed, and the Thunderbolt rocketed down the runway, bleeding speed through friction alone. He ran out of runway at approximately 40 miles per hour. The P-47 bounced over the grass overrun, plowed through a drainage ditch, and came to rest in a Belgian potato field with its nose buried in dirt and its tail pointing at the sky. Prescott sat in the ruined cockpit for a long moment, breathing. His hands were still gripping the useless stick. His face was covered in dried blood. His engine was silent. His aircraft was destroyed, and he was alive. The fire crews reached him 2 minutes later. They pried open the shattered canopy and found Prescott still strapped in his seat, staring straight ahead, apparently in shock. A medic climbed onto the wing and checked his pulse. "You all right, Lieutenant?" Prescott looked at him. "I need to report," he said. "I need to tell someone. Patterson and Webb. They went down over Belgium. They might still be alive." "We'll handle it, Lieutenant. Let's get you out of there." They lifted him from the cockpit and laid him on a stretcher. As they carried him toward the ambulance, Prescott turned his head and looked back at his P-47. He would not fully understand the extent of the damage until he saw the photographs days later in the hospital at Liège. The damage assessment team counted 217 separate holes in Prescott's Thunderbolt. The primary flight control cables, aileron and elevator, had been completely severed in 4 places. The hydraulic system had been destroyed. The pneumatic system had been destroyed. The radio, battery, and electrical bus had been destroyed. 6 of 18 engine cylinders had been destroyed. The propeller had taken 11 hits. The canopy had been shattered. The cockpit floor had been holed in 3 places. The assessment officer wrote in his report, "Aircraft should not have been flyable. Survival of pilot unexplainable by engineering analysis." Patterson had survived. He had belly landed his crippled P-47 in a Belgian pasture, walked away from the crash, and been picked up by American ground forces that evening. Webb had also survived, bailing out over the Ardennes when his engine finally seized, spending 2 weeks with the Belgian resistance before making it back to Allied lines. Bergstrom, who had gone down with Patterson, had shepherded his damaged wingman to the deck, watched him crash land safely, and then nursed his own shot-up Thunderbolt back to Martlesham Heath, landing on fumes, with 47 holes in his aircraft. All 4 members of Viper Blue Flight survived. The Germans had not fared as well. Of the 5 Focke-Wulfs that had attacked Prescott's flight, 3 had been shot down and their pilots killed. The 4th pilot, who had attacked Webb, was wounded by return fire and crash-landed in Germany, dying of his injuries 3 days later. Only Hauptmann Victor Ehrlich survived the engagement unscathed. Ehrlich would survive the war. He flew until the final week, surrendering to American forces on May 4, 1945, with 71 confirmed victories. During his interrogation, he mentioned the engagement over Belgium, the American in the Thunderbolt who would not die, the aircraft that flew without controls, the pilot who had somehow landed a machine that should have fallen from the sky. "I hit him with everything," Ehrlich told his interrogators. "I put 200 shells into his aircraft, and he just kept flying. I have never seen anything like it. I hope I never see anything like it again." Prescott spent 3 weeks in the hospital at Liège, recovering from his wounds. The fragment in his forehead had missed his skull by a 1/4 inch. The shrapnel in his shoulder had nicked an artery, but not severed it. The glass cuts on his hands and face healed cleanly, leaving scars that he would carry for the rest of his life. The Army Air Forces awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's 2nd highest award for valor. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism in aerial combat and his exceptional skill in recovering an aircraft damaged beyond any reasonable expectation of survival. It did not mention that he had flown the last 20 minutes of the engagement using only trim tabs and rudder. It did not mention that he had landed at twice the normal touchdown speed with no brakes, no flaps, and no functional controls. Some things did not fit in official citations. Prescott returned to combat in November 1944. He flew 31 more missions before the war ended, adding 4 more aerial victories to his total. His final score was 22 confirmed kills, making him one of the top aces of the European theater. He never lost another aircraft. After the war, Prescott went home to Chillicothe, Missouri. He married his high school sweetheart, a woman named Dorothy Gaines, who had written him every week of the war, 417 letters in total, which Prescott kept in a shoebox under their bed until the day he died. They bought a farm outside town, 160 acres of good Missouri bottomland, and grew corn and soybeans and raised 3 children, David Jr., born in 1947, Margaret in 1949, and Thomas in 1952. Prescott went back to crop dusting, flying low over the fields in a surplus Stearman biplane, the same work he had done before the war. He found comfort in the routine of it, the early morning takeoffs, the methodical passes over the crops, the satisfaction of a job done well. The Stearman was slow and forgiving, nothing like the P-47, and that was exactly what he wanted. He had done enough high-speed flying for one lifetime. He became a fixture in Chillicothe, known as a quiet man who showed up early for church, coached Little League Baseball for 15 years, and could fix any piece of farm equipment ever made. The younger men in town knew he had been a fighter pilot, knew he had medals in a drawer somewhere, but Prescott never talked about it. When the 4th of July parade needed a veteran to ride in the lead car, he always declined. When the VFW asked him to speak at Memorial Day ceremonies, he sent his regrets. He never spoke about the September 18th mission. Dorothy knew something had happened. The scars on his face and hands told her that much, but he would not discuss the details. When his children asked about the war, he told them stories about England, about the food, about the friends he had made. He did not tell them about flying a crippled fighter across Belgium with no controls. He did not tell them about landing at 165 miles per hour in a machine that should have been his coffin. In 1987, a historian named Dr. Robert Caldwell tracked Prescott down while researching a book on P-47 pilots. Caldwell had found the damage assessment report in the National Archives, had seen the photographs of the destroyed Thunderbolt, and had become obsessed with finding the pilot who had somehow survived. Prescott was 67 years old when Caldwell arrived at his farm. They sat on the porch, drinking lemonade, looking out over the fields where Dorothy's roses bloomed along the fence line. Caldwell asked him about the mission. "It was a long time ago," Prescott said. "The engineering report says your aircraft shouldn't have been flyable. They couldn't explain how you controlled it." "Trim tabs," Prescott said. "The trim tabs still worked. I flew the whole thing on trim tabs and rudder." Caldwell stared at him. He had interviewed dozens of pilots, had heard hundreds of war stories, but he had never heard of anyone flying a fighter on trim tabs alone. "That should have been impossible," he said. "Maybe." Prescott sipped his lemonade. "But the Jug was a tough airplane. She didn't want to quit, and I didn't want to quit either. So we just kept going until we found a place to land." "The Germans put over 200 shells into you." "I know. I counted the holes later. 217. Prescott shook his head. "Ehrlich, the German flight leader, he was good. One of the best I ever flew against. He did everything right. Hit me from multiple angles. Took out my controls, my hydraulics, my radio. He should have killed me. But he didn't. No, he didn't." Prescott was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle over the cornfield. "I've thought about it a lot over the years. Why I survived. Some of the boys didn't, you know. Good pilots, better than me, and they didn't make it home. I've never figured out why I did. What do you think it was?" Prescott considered the question. "I think it was the airplane," he said finally. "Republic built that thing to survive. Air-cooled engine, redundant systems, controls that could take damage and keep working. The P-47 saved my life. I was just along for the ride." Caldwell published his book in 1989. A single chapter covered Prescott's mission, complete with photographs of the damaged aircraft and excerpts from the engineering report. The chapter was titled "The Unflyable Flight." David Allen Prescott died on October 3, 2001, at the age of 81. Heart failure, peaceful, at home, with Dorothy beside him. He was buried in the Chillicothe Cemetery, his gravestone marked with a small bronze P-47 that his children had commissioned from a local artist. The inscription read, "He flew when flying was impossible." The wreckage of his P-47, tail number 42-76521, was scrapped in Belgium in late 1944. No parts survive. No museum displays a piece of the Thunderbolt that flew without controls. There is only the damage assessment report in the National Archives, the photographs of the holes, and the testimony of a German ace who could not believe what he had failed to kill. Victor Ehrlich died in Munich in 1978. In his personal papers discovered after his death was a single photograph, a P-47 Thunderbolt, trailing smoke, flying west over Belgium. On the back, in Ehrlich's handwriting, were two words in German, Der Unbesiegbare, the unconquerable. If you want to hear more forgotten stories from the Second World War, please subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. These men are gone now, their stories fading with them. The least we can do is remember. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.